All right, hey folks, in this video, we're gonna do something a little different by peeling back the covers on behavioral interview questions. You might have seen a list of common questions or gone through interviews before and thought to yourself, like, what should they really want me to talk about? Or how is this being evaluated? In this video, we're gonna go deep to try to walk you through what interviewers are thinking, what they're writing down in their evaluations, potholes to avoid, and tips for how you can choose from your experience and present it. Just by way of introduction, I'm Stefan. I'm one of the co-founders of Hello Interview. I was a senior manager at Meta and a bar raiser at Amazon, and I've conducted north of 2,000 interviews. I've talked to a lot of candidates. For this session, I brought an expert, my friend Austen, who you might recognize from a previous discussion that we had on the channel. Austen led teams across Meta, including the recruiting products team, and was hiring committee chair. He's also an author. I've heard some rumbling about a book on the horizon. Did you want to give us a quick plug, Austen?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Stefan. It's awesome to be here. Like, really fun to talk about behavioral interviews. And yes, I have been working on a book. It's called Mastering Behavioral Interviews for almost 2 years now. And it is really close to being ready. I even have a preprint right here. I'm really excited about it. There's not a lot of behavioral interview content available on the internet. And so I really wanted to make something that was awesome for people who want to work at tech companies. Most of the stuff out there is just use the STAR method, doesn't go very much beyond that. So in this book, I'm sharing insights on what companies are looking for, step-by-step guide on how to prepare, and some advanced storytelling techniques for senior folks. So if people want to learn more about it, they can check out my Substack newsletter.
Perfect. And I've actually gotten to read a little bit of this preprint. It is good stuff. So definitely check out Austen's newsletter. I'll include it down in the comments. Also, if you're looking for more detailed information about how questions are evaluated, we actually maintain a bank of community reported questions on the Hello Interview website. And on those pages, we have breakdowns, peer answers, editorials. Definitely worth checking out. I'll include a link as well. I want to start with a celebrity question that I see asked in almost every interview. Tell me about a conflict you had with a coworker. How did you resolve it? And this question, we've seen it reported at Meta, Amazon, Apple, Datadog. Austen, what are interviewers trying to learn from this question?
Yeah, classic question. I think this is definitely one of the three most common questions that I prepare my coaching clients for, and you're definitely going to receive this question. I think in tech company culture, we believe that disagreement is this path to better outcomes, and we've believed that for a really long time. And that's why companies care about this question, right? They want to assess your ability to embrace instead of avoid conflict. They want to see whether you're going to make the team, the product, the people better at their company when those disagreements come up. And they're really assessing a number of very specific skills with this kind of question. So first, they're assessing, of course, conflict resolution skills. Can you navigate a conflict with empathy? Can you solve problems looking for win-win solutions? Can you focus on business outcomes while you are having this interpersonal conflict? They're also, of course, assessing communication skills. So how do you talk to coworkers in different circumstances and situations? Do you use messaging? Do you use meetings? Do you use in-person conversations? And then they're also getting some assessment of your level. So what level you're operating at inside of a company. There's some data out there that indicates that this is a question which is really critical for assessing whether someone is at a certain level or not. And it's based on the scope of those conflicts that they're engaged in.
Yeah, then I talk with a bunch of candidates, and they tell me, I haven't gotten in a big argument with someone. I don't get into conflicts. What would you say to those people? What would you suggest to them in terms of how they can choose from the stories that exist in their careers?
I hear this one a lot in coaching experiences, coaching sessions, is they think that the interviewer is asking them about whether or not they are someone who starts conflicts. And of course, nobody wants to be the person who starts conflicts, right? And so everyone begins with this, well, I don't really have conflicts, or da, 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 da. But that's not what the person is looking for. We all have quote unquote conflicts. And we're not always talking about, knock down, drag out, emotional fights, yelling, screaming. That could be a story that goes with this question, but that's not really what the person is meaning. They just mean, when are there disagreements between you and someone else? And this happens all the time. Disagreements in terms of, how we should prioritize work, how we should implement different technical features, how we should run the team. All those things are really common conflicts. So when you're going about choosing a conflict or thinking about conflicts from your past, you want to pick ones that fit three different dimensions. So one of them is high stakes. I think if you're having a conflict over whether or not to use spaces or tabs. This is probably not like a great conflict to highlight unless you're a very junior person. So the outcome needs to matter to the business or to the project. That's number one. Number two is it needs to involve you deeply. So if you were just a peripheral person in this conflict, if you were just in the room while the conflict is happening, but you weren't central to its resolution, then that's probably not a great story to tell. And I think especially if you are new to behavioral interviews, you want to choose an example where you were right. You can tell stories about when you were wrong. I think that has some value. We could maybe talk about that later, but I think it's much harder to do that especially if you're just learning how to do behavioral interviews. So choose one where you were right.
I like the involvement that you're calling out here too, because it seems like some candidates will go the opposite direction. Instead of choosing something consequential, they will choose a grand story about something that happened in their organization, but it was clear that they were mostly an audience, that they weren't actually the ones who were helping to resolve this conflict or move things forward.
I think that gets us to this question about like leveling and what if you are a certain level, what kinds of conflicts should you choose, right? And I think that if you're a more junior or a mid-level person, oftentimes this is conflicts between you and someone else, like a peer, right? And oftentimes you may have needed to seek help when you were resolving this conflict. If you're more senior, say you're a senior engineer, like level 5 or a level 6 staff engineer, then oftentimes those conflicts are between you and someone who's not an engineer, maybe not on the team, maybe a cross-functional peer like a product manager, or maybe even someone who is off the team, right? Another team that you're engaging with, right? And oftentimes this kind of conflict resolution involves more than just talking about things, but it involves some kind of assessing, gathering data and evaluating it, or building a proof of concept, something like that. And then if you're a staff level person or a principal engineer or a manager, then oftentimes these conflicts are organizational in nature. So there's some kind of systemic challenge which exists in the organization that you're a part of. And oftentimes that resolution involves you or someone else coming to the table with some kind of solution which prevents those future conflicts from arising.
Now, I think a lot of candidates really struggle with their time management. Either they give a short, 10-second response, or they're spending 30 minutes giving the kind of grand vision here without necessarily giving additional signal to the interviewer. Do you have any suggestions for candidates on how they ought to spend their time in coming up with the response and presenting what their experience was?
Yeah, so when we're giving a response for a behavioral interview question, really what the person is assessing is those repeatable actions that you are telling the interviewer that you did. Those are the things that you're going to be able to take with you when you join that company. So if you gathered data, if you went and talked to the person, if you were empathetic to their position, those are the kinds of actions that they are looking for. So the action part, oftentimes we talk about either STAR format, situation, task, action, result, or CARL, context, action, result, learnings. No matter what format you want to use for telling these stories, that action is right there in the middle. And that's what everybody should be spending most of their time on. And then the other pieces that are around that, whether it's the situation or the task or the context section, whatever you want to call it, those pieces are there so that the interviewer can understand what actions that you took and why those were the right actions. And then the results and learnings pieces are there to showcase the level and showcase the impact of what you're doing, and also give a little bit of self-reflection. So you should spend most of your time, maybe think about it as 60% of your time on the actions that you took during this conflict, and maybe spend just a little bit of time on the context, maybe 10% of your time. For this particular question, it's the result part is needs to be kind of deeper than maybe the result part for other behavioral interview questions. Oftentimes, the result of some project-oriented question is, well, we shipped the project, and then this was the business result, and this is what happened. But here you have the result of the conflict itself, which is what happened on the architectural choice or process choice or whatever the conflict was about. And then you also have some relationship state. So what happened between you and this person? So if you resolve the conflict and the business moves forward, but the person never wants to work with you again, then that's not really great conflict resolution skills. So you need to spend a little bit more time, maybe 20% of your time on the result side. And then ideally, I love to have responses which could come with some kind of learning, some sort of reflection about what you learned in the experience, what you would do differently, or what you did in the future. And I think that's a great, another like 10% of your time, just a little bit of time at the end.
It seems like there's a ton of actions that you can kind of cover, and there are all sorts of details that we can get into. And fortunately, you're spending the majority of your time here is there kind of a checklist that you have in mind for things that people ought to make sure that they cover in giving a great response to a question like this?
Yeah, definitely. I think when I'm listening to one of these responses and assessing you as a candidate, I want to see that you sought to understand first, right? Wanted to understand what the other person's perspective is. I think if you rush forward with some sort of solution, then I think that really loses out an opportunity to build connection and get to the best solution at the end. So seek to understand first, and then there's some sort of sign of empathy. So I think sometimes even in emotionally charged situations or stories that had some sort of negative impact on you, you still need to be able to express and acknowledge the constraints that the other person was under, maybe their motivations for why they believe whatever they believed. So showing that kind of empathy is important. I want that in my coworkers. So I want that in the person that I'm interviewing. And then ideally, there's some sort of objective way to resolve this conflict. So if it's about some architectural choice, maybe we can build a proof of concept. If it's about how to prioritize something, then maybe we'll go and gather some user research or do some data analysis. So whenever we use data and evidence to make decisions, I think that's a really strong signal to send the interviewer about yourself. And there's a couple of other things. So I think one of them is oftentimes when we're having these conflicts, we are having to communicate with different people, maybe with the person itself, maybe with our manager, maybe with other people on the team. And then the way that you communicate, so the channel even, so whether it's a Slack meeting or whether it's a one-on-one meeting or whether you went to see them in person. So I think oftentimes these conflicts, sometimes they start in a written format, like on a PR or something, and then they need to move towards a more, higher bandwidth experience where it's face-to-face. So seeing how the candidate chose the right communication channel and how they leverage that channel to move the conflict forward is really something I look for. And then I would say that kind of towards the end, if we're looking at the resolution, ideally the candidate is coming up with some kind of win-win situation for this conflict. Maybe not everybody gets all the things that they want, but we make some compromise, or the other person's needs are acknowledged and filled in some way as we exit this conflict. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it's really important that the conflict preserves the relationship. So I need to see that, at the end of this actions, I need to see that you worked with this person well in the future. And that's what I mean by preserving the relationships.
There are some candidates, when they hear this question about conflict, they immediately go and think about someplace where they won. And I think this usually misses the mark for most interviewers who are really trying to understand, how did you actually work with coworkers who are on your team to go and come up with a better outcome? And so definitely avoid situations where you're vilifying your coworkers or the other side. In some sense, actually, the more rational they are and the more sensible they are, the richer the story is. So avoid situations where the other side is doing something obviously stupid, because those actually don't make you seem as strong. These questions are behavioral questions. Some candidates will look at the conflict stories and they'll think about, what results did I get at the end, which it's important. Although Austen, I think, mentioned earlier that maybe 10 to 20% of your time ought to be spent there. Be careful about those situations where your emphasis is primarily on some technical achievement or business outcome and less on the behaviors between you and your colleagues. Austen, are there any other kind of red flags or things that people ought to avoid in this question?
Yeah, we mentioned a number of them. I think being unempathetic, like we talked about before, is a big one. So if you're focusing on winning that argument, for sure. I think one that doesn't come up very often in conversations I've had with folks about they don't identify as a pitfall, but it does happen a lot, which is that there's sometimes candidates hide emotional content. So I'm listening to the story and it just feels like something is missing. And then I ask a little bit of follow-ups and I find out that, actually there was a blow up. The other person maybe blew up in a meeting, or there was some really emotionally charged experience that the candidate had to endure in order to go through this conflict. And they think, because we said, like what we said earlier, they think that they should hide that in some, maybe every interaction that they describe should somehow be professional. But if the reality was that the other parties in this conflict were not professional, I do think that you should mention that. You need to acknowledge that in a professional way. You don't disparage them or insult them. I think that you need to, again, acknowledge what they were going through and what their motivations were. But if it was a difficult meeting and somebody even yelling at you or cursing you out or whatever, I think acknowledging that in a professional way showcases that you can persevere through those kinds of challenges and come out the other side with a successful resolution. So don't hide emotional content if it's there in the story. Oftentimes these conflicts, we wait too long, right? And we maybe there's some disagreement. The disagreement bubbles too long. Maybe the conversation in the meeting happens too long, or the conversation over the PR happens too long before we sort of eject out of the normal day-to-day work environment and say, this is a conflict. I need to handle this in a different way. And so if that was the case, then you need to frame that carefully. Because that is definitely something that we're looking for, that you proactively engage in conflicts in a time reasonable manner. And of course, this is much more important for the more senior you are. So if you're a very senior manager or a very senior IC, you should be seeing conflicts ahead of time and engaging with them quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually is a great segue into the next thing that I wanted to touch on, which is just, for the higher levels, sometimes this question will be asked slightly differently. So like one example I usually ask for managers and staff and senior staff engineers is, can you share an example of a conflict between different teams or departments that you helped to resolve? I'm curious from your perspective, as we start to walk up this ladder in terms of leveling, are there different valences and things that candidates need to touch on? What would you say are like the more important things that start to show up at those most senior levels?
So one thing is that there is this dynamic between organizations, and you can call it politics, or that's kind of a dirty word, but you can call it whatever you want. There's some kind of dynamics between different organizations. So can you navigate those? Can you understand what's happening around you? Why different organizations might have this motivation or that motivation, and then be able to navigate that successfully. So sometimes there are these competing incentives that teams may have. And so can you understand those incentives and then be able to find that win-win situation? And then the other thing is that in these situations, I'm looking for leaders not just to come out the other side back kind of like in the status quo, like back where we started, like we resolved the conflict, but we're sort of fundamentally in the same place. Maybe the conflict may arise again, but I'm looking for leaders to say, oh, this is a conflict about, product ownership. And yes, we can resolve this one, but what about the general boundaries between the teams? So I'm looking for those systemic solutions that leaders are able to bring in and then prevent the next similar kind of conflict from happening. These leadership stories, sometimes they involve other people. So there's a you and there's a team, of course, but sometimes they might involve your management chain, their management chain, or partners that you have, or maybe even folks on your team, senior engineers and whatnot. So when you bring in the right people at the right time, you don't bring them in too early, wasting their time, so quickly escalating just because you can't resolve the conflict, but you don't also wait, knowing that sometimes you do need management support in order to resolve a conflict.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the emphasis on incentives as well. I think especially for leadership candidates, there's this expectation from interviewers that this person kind of has X-ray vision for the org structure in some sense, and that they're able to bring some insights to the table about why this conflict arose and what does that mean for how they changed their response. Really strong candidates are able to give you the backstory and say, here's why this team is acting this way. It sounds a little unusual, but if you understood that, then everything else makes sense. And then here's what I did as a response. And it's going to differ than what I would do in the average situation where that didn't happen. So really love to see insights from candidates. And I think some of the things that you called out there around incentives are really good. For leadership candidates, do you still recommend that same kind of 60% of the time spent on action, or do you want to see a different breakdown?
These numbers are sort of arbitrary. I would say that yes, in general, of course, focus on actions. That's what we're evaluating you on. But I would also say that the context can sometimes get a little bit longer for, like you said, I want to understand what the motivation of the other team was. And my warning there is that managers and senior leaders tend to like to talk. That's what we do, right? Sometimes as managers. And so, yes, I think that might need to expand some in order for the listener to understand the story, but be very careful about how much context is added there. Because one of the things I'm assessing you on, especially as a leader, is do you tell me the important parts of the story? Because that's what you're going to be doing every day when you're talking to engineers, when you're talking to executives, when you're talking to other teams. You're going to be communicating and choosing the most important words in an efficient way. So I need to see that efficient context.
Let's keep going. And I want to change maybe about 45 degrees into a question that's still related to conflict, but more about the day-to-day work. And this one is a bit of a doozy. I find this question is somewhat culturally loaded, but usually you'll see a question like, what was a situation where you didn't agree with your manager or your superior's decision? And somewhat implicit in the question is like, all right, well, how did you go ahead and make that known? I have noticed that candidates on the East Coast, in New York, for instance, maybe they came from a finance background where disagreeing with your manager is just not something that people do, oftentimes struggle with questions like this. And frankly, as an interviewer, I don't like questions where there is a bunch of cultural bias like that. They tend to not give as good of signal, but it's undoubtedly a question that gets asked quite frequently. What are companies getting at here? What are they hoping to gain from candidates when asking this question? And how does it differ from some of the things that we talked about already?
Yeah, I mean, definitely these you can call them West Coast, Silicon Valley, whatever, tech company culture is one where we think conflict creates better outcomes. And so companies are looking for whether or not you will speak up when you see problems, right? Saving the team and the company from making bad decisions. And in those cases, they want to see that you can do that respectfully and professionally. And I think that's one of the filters that you're getting on this question is if you're disagreeing with the manager, it needs to be done in a respectful way. You as an engineer, you sometimes there are choices when you need to push back against a manager, against a decision, and sometimes when you need to just say, you know what, I'm just going to disagree and commit. This is just what the team's going to do. And so in that way, I'm assessing your judgment. So when you tell me this story, if I felt like you didn't properly justify the pushback and the kind of tax that you put on the team by bringing up this conflict and pursuing it, then I question your judgment after that. You want your engineers to be thought partners and not just executors, right? It's not just sort of automatons that take instructions. And so we're looking to see if you're that kind of partner that can make the team better.
How does that partnership come through? Like, can you give some examples of responses that candidates might give that really exemplify a thought partner versus an automaton?
Yeah, great question. I think that there's situations where maybe you're making a technical choice, right? And your manager has decided this is what the organization is going to do. And then you want to take this opportunity to say, you know what, I think this technical choice has these drawbacks, and you have to present that. There could be a hiring choice. Maybe you're participating in a hiring conversation and your manager really wants to hire this person or really doesn't want to hire this person, and you disagree. And then you need to advocate for that. Maybe there's a situation where there's some kind of process question. So oftentimes engineers are in places where managers calling a lot of meetings and trying to get things done in that kind of collaborative way. And maybe you as an engineer understand that you need to change the culture of the team and be able to make it more shifted towards execution. So there's like a lot of opportunities that I think we have to disagree with our management chain.
A lot of those are signals of trust. In some sense, when hiring managers are conducting behavioral interviews, they're looking to see, okay, was this person trusted by their leadership chain? And if you're getting brought into major decisions and hiring decisions and you're pushing back, that usually means that, they trust your judgment, and they also think that you're a good enough deliverer that you need to have a seat at the table for these things. I think this comes back to something that Austen has harped on before, which is that in some sense, the way that you become good at behavioral interviews is actually very similar to what it takes to become good at your job. And if you can think about those things that build trust and that enable you to access to kind of higher level projects, those are the same things that you ideally are able to highlight in some of your behavioral responses. Now, you gave me some good examples of things that you probably might touch on, or these are some examples of ways that you can touch on this positively. What are those stories that you should avoid? Like, if somebody asks you this question, are there particular things that you shouldn't bring up?
No, there are some things. So I think if you're say just airing grievances, I think this is not a good space for that. Things like, hey, I got a bad performance review and I had to talk to my manager about it, or I didn't get promoted and I really wanted to and I had to talk to my manager about it. I think these are questions, these are these kinds of issues that it's hard for the person to assess who's making the right decision, whether it was you or your manager. And so I think that's probably not a great story. Remember, I talked about times when you were right. I think this is the ideally the kinds of conflicts that you're bringing up. I think on the other side, it's trivial disagreements. So again, I brought up code formatting style. I like that one it's funny, but I think that people sometimes bring it up as a disagreement they have. This shows that you're petty, right, in the things that you bring up, and that's not helpful. We talked about avoiding conflicts where you were wrong, or maybe you just don't like the idea. And then it's difficult. Maybe there's some kind of product choice or something that your manager is making, or maybe they made a choice about a tool or something, and you just don't like it. You don't have a lot of objective reasoning. You just personal preference, that's not a great one, right? Again, we can't assess your judgment via that kind of story. And if you had a very sort of emotional conflict with your manager, then I think that could be a dangerous story to tell, because sometimes we can detect that as humans. We're listening to the story and we know, oh, there's a lot of feelings that you have about this story. So you need to be careful either telling that story in a sort of medium tone kind of way, and one way where you've processed those emotions, or maybe picking a different story where that's not have as much of an emotional impact on you.
Yeah, don't pick up the hot pan, especially because a lot of people end up interviewing after they've had an experience like that. And so maybe this, while fresh on your mind, isn't necessarily the right thing to bring up in an interview in order to show off kind of your capabilities. Throughout your response, the interviewer is writing stuff down in their notebook. I'm curious from your perspective, and everybody's different. All interviewers are going to write down different things, but like, what are the main things that are being evaluated? What would you say are like the rubric that an interviewer might have for this question?
So I think it's very similar to a general conflict question that we talked about earlier, right? I think the things that where it's different is, and we didn't talk about this yet, which is that thinking can be one action. Right. So I think when you are involved in these deeper conflicts and where there might be power dynamics involved, or even the cross-team one like we talked about last time, this thought process, revealing to me the thought process that you went through so that I can assess your judgment, becomes an important part of the rubric. But additionally, because there's this respectful piece, or this filter, which is on top of it about disagreeing with your manager, then I want to see that you thought through timing. I want to see through that you had careful thinking about the channel that you used to bring up this conflict, right? The tone that you brought it up. Those are all important things. And typically I'm looking for whether you're well prepared. So I would not go and start a conflict with my manager, address a conflict with my manager. If I knew I was missing data, for example, I would go collect that data first and then bring that to my manager, right? And I think that acknowledging and being humble to understand that the manager has context that I don't have, right? That's part of their role, is to acquire higher level context and then give it to me. And so if I'm asking questions, that's healthy, right? I want to see that the person, again, is seeking to understand the input. We talked about that before. And, I want to see if you were successful. Again, if you have a conflict with your manager, but you aren't able to convince them, maybe that's okay. Maybe the manager was right, but it isn't a great look for you in the behavioral interview. It makes it difficult for me to assess that final piece, which is whether you're able to convince someone of your point of view. And I think that kind of, we got them to change their mind and commit to your position. I really want to see that in the actions.
Well, let's go ahead and move on from conflict. We talked about this for a bit here. I want to go to another category of questions that are really common in behavioral interviews, and they're usually pretty open-ended. One that's a classic right now and that seems to be asked amongst a variety of different companies is, tell me about a project that you're most proud of. I think, generally companies are trying to get signal on like, why are you proud? But also, what are you bringing to the table? Why do companies ask questions like this? And then how do these differ in some sense from like smaller questions like these conflict stories that we've been talking about earlier?
Yeah, so this is a much broader question, like you're talking about. It's really getting a sense of what your overall career has been like, and what you have accomplished as an engineer. And so the interviewer can collect a lot of signal in a short period of time by listening to these stories. So for sure, they're trying to get at your scope. So at what level do you operate? What is it that you do? And to that scope question, they're trying to get at where your ceiling is. So what's the largest scope, largest amount of time, largest technical complexity, largest organizational complexity that you've operated at? And of course, if we're talking about a project that you're really proud of, that means that you probably did well in this project. So they're looking for this ownership, this end-to-end ownership. Those are really big pieces. And I would say that while you focused on this question, these kinds of questions about projects, they might be really, really common. And there might be a bunch of them that fit with this kind of format. So things like, tell me about a big, ambitious project. Tell me about a project that was very ambiguous. You know, tell me about your favorite project. So I think all of these things are trying to get at the same idea. And they're getting at, the motivation for why you wanted to work on this project. They're getting at your connection to business outcomes. So what are we doing here? We're hiring engineers to use technology to deliver business outcomes, right? And so when I ask you about these projects, I want to see that you're connected to that. Of course, problem solving skills, right? We always encounter these problems when we have projects that we work on. And then I mentioned ambiguity. And I think ambiguity is another big signal area that an interviewer is listening to when they're hearing these kinds of responses. They want to know, are you able to take an ambiguous problem, break it down into smaller pieces and execute it? The communication even, right? So of course, inside of the story, there might be times when you communicated, and that's important. But I'm also, by asking you this big open-ended question, I'm seeing, can you organize and tell me a well-structured story that's interesting to listen to and that guides me as the listener, as the interviewer, towards what's most important and what made you successful? Do you even know like what made you successful? Do you know what good planning and good execution looks like? And can you draw me a picture of how you did that, verbally? And that is a big indicator of your communication skills, especially for senior candidates.
You brought up a bunch of things that end up being signals on the evaluation side, like how you can deal with ambiguity, bias for action. This is very common. I think Uber has a parallel to Amazon in this respect. And sometimes these questions are hard to just ask upfront. Like, tell me about a time where you showed bias for action. But on the other hand, they're usually pretty apparent when you go tell longer stories. And so those are chances for you to kind of showcase the characteristics that your interviewer wants you to get after. So candidates obviously need to be preparing major projects that they can talk through in their behavioral interviews. How would you say they ought to go about selecting a project? I often hear from candidates that I've talked to, oh, I don't have anything web scale that I've worked on, or my projects are boring and they're uninteresting. What would you say to them as kind of an algorithm for them to work through in terms of finding the project that's going to be most relevant for this type of question?
Yeah, I definitely see this with candidates who are going maybe from a non-FANG or a non-Mango company. They're trying to get into a larger web scale business, and they feel insecure about the kinds of projects they've had. And so what I tell them is, look, we're hiring you to do honestly like day-to-day work, like to take a project from beginning to end, to identify some business needs and build some things. You've probably done that. You have probably identified some business needs and built some technology in order to achieve those business needs. And so don't be afraid to present the work that you did as being representative of you working through every stage of the software development lifecycle. And so when you think about projects that you have and you want to see which is the right one, I think there's 3 dimensions that you optimize for. So one of them is impact. I think you want to choose a project that had meaningful business or user outcomes. Another one is scope. But this is what we're talking about, what we're getting at, right? How do we is the work at the scale that's appropriate for your level, the amount of time, the amount of technical complexity, the amount of people that you worked with, and then again, personal contribution, right? Similar to how we talked about conflict resolution. You need to be this primary driver or somebody who is deeply invested in this project and not sort of peripheral to this project. Now, I think the one other thing I would say is sometimes you're given some sort of specific flavor to this question, like we talked about a time when a project was very ambiguous, or a time when you had a very large project with with a customer, external customer, or something like that, right? So if you're given this sort of flavor, then ideally you're able to put that filter on top of your stories and then pick one that fits that model as well.
Okay, so I guess from the candidate perspective, go and think about, major projects that you've been through, and then maybe rank them according to these 3 dimensions: impact, scope, personal contribution, and then try to find those that are really highly ranked on each of those dimensions. Is that a good strategy?
I think it's a great strategy. Yeah. So if you're a level 3, level 4, this is like a junior engineer, or software development 1, software developer 2, that sort of thing. Maybe 0 to 3, 4 years experience. Then we're expecting that kind of story to be at the feature levels. It's like 1 to 4 weeks worth of work. Maybe you implemented it most of the way yourself. There was probably some guidance at some experience, some point along the way. So an example might be that you, built a profile settings page, right, from design all the way to deployment, something like that. And if you are a senior engineer, like a level 5 engineer, then usually that's operating at the project level, maybe 1 month, maybe 3 months, something like that. There's probably some other people involved, maybe 1 or 2 other engineers that you're working with. And really, I'm looking for your contribution to be some sort of leadership pieces. So that's technical leadership, design, technical implementation. You're doing the hardest parts, right? Maybe you're coordinating with other cross-functional partners like product management or design. Some examples there is like, you led some migration from a REST API endpoint to a GraphQL API for some mobile app or something like that. That would be a project that requires some thinking and planning in advance, and maybe there's a number of people involved to that one. And then as we sort of keep going, right? So senior staff level 6, I think I'm looking for a significant project. It's like 6 months, maybe even 12 months. There could be multiple work streams, right? There could be there's some goal attached, some large goal attached to this effort. Almost, you can call it an effort in that sense, that may have multiple project size pieces underneath it that at level 5s are working on. So here I'm looking for you that you drove vision, right? That you maybe created architecture, that you coordinated with a lot of people. So maybe an example is something like architected and led some implementation of real-time notification system or something, right? And you serving, I don't know, millions of users, something like that. I think that would be common for a level 6. And then level 7, that sort of principal level, this is some major initiative. It's probably over a year long. These are things like platform modernizations, right? And that enable lots of teams to do something, maybe ship faster or improve their developer experience or implement some new technology, right? And so here I'm looking for strategic influence. You set the direction for the whole organization, not just for the team, and that you unblocked those teams along the way and made decisions and pivots as circumstances changed.
I'm definitely noting there's like a time dimension to this, that, as you rank up, that there's expectation that you're working on things for longer periods. I guess this is a nice note for people who are job hopping, that, you do want to be able to maintain enough duration with a company to be able to put on your resume some of these accomplishments. But I've talked with candidates and they're in this dilemma. They basically say, hey, my most recent project, I think very much meets the scope and complexity, but I'm not done with it yet. We've still got 3 months. It hasn't been delivered. I worked on some stuff a year or two ago at another company that I have delivered, but it really doesn't map to the scope that we were talking about. How would you suggest for engineers to try to think about the trade-offs here in choosing a story?
Well, trade-offs is the right call, because I don't think there is a clear answer to the story, like always pick this one, always pick that one. I think that the trade-offs you mentioned are recency. And of course, recency has an impact on scope. And that's what you're calling out, that older stories are often lower scope stories. But then if it is unfinished, then that's going to affect my assessment of your ability to drive results. And so I would only choose the more recent story if my older stories are significantly lower scope than the one that I could potentially tell now. And B, I have some sort of progress. And so ideally there's some sort of like, hey, we have milestones and I'm going to show that I'm delivering against the milestones, or we have some sort of goal, KPI, metric that we're working towards, and we are sort of progressing along that path. So I think the story without any results, for me to assess whether or not you made the right call or whether or not you're going, barking up the right tree or not, I think that's pretty hard. It's pretty hard for me to listen unless the question is very specific onto some kind of action that you want to highlight in this more recent story. If it's just asking me about a project that has no results and no measurable impact, I think it's difficult to assess that kind of story as an interviewer.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, and you're right. I don't think there is like a firm answer. I think every time someone's asked me this, I've gone, well, let me think about this for a minute. But I think you're right to think about this more defensively. Like a lot of interviewers, as they're assessing, are going to be asking themselves, well, did this pan out? Was this actually a project where we showed significant impact? Or maybe this is going to go sideways when they actually get to the fun part where they deliver it to production. And as such, you need to be prepared to kind of defend against those issues. And so being able to speak to the milestones, being able to approach why you're confident this is going to show the results that you have are going to be really critical if you choose that story. But it's always going to be a bit of a play in deciding between what's going to be most effective. And it comes down to a point-by-point decision. Somebody's old story might be better. Somebody's new story might be inappropriate. It really just depends. But I like the guidelines that you gave here. So we've got big, meaty stories that people are talking about. If you're at the staff level, you're talking about something that took an entire year. How should candidates think about actually delivering and presenting this? Because the worst case scenario is they start off by telling me about the nuances of C# and all of the various lambdas that they wrote before they can actually get into the meat of the story. What's the key to delivering a big, meaty project story?
Right. So we talked about communication as being something that I'm assessing when I'm listening to these kinds of stories, right? I want to know that you know what was important inside of the work that you did. And so if especially if you're seeing your organization is going to be really critical, you can still use a star format or a Carl format in general, but after your context and situation setting time, it's ideally a case where you can give me a table of contents. And this is some list of the most important parts of what I'm going to be hearing when I'm listening to you tell me this story. Something like, hey, there was an investigation and design phase where I had to gather a lot of information from many teams, right? There is a driving alignment with stakeholders time where I had to work with my VP to secure resources. Then there were some hard technical choices that I had to dive in with the team and solve on the networking side. And then I had to think about, some kind of careful rollout that we did. I had to organize a careful rollout over time to ensure safety. So I think something like that gives me both a sense of what I'm going to hear, like what the different parts are, and also tells me what I'm going to learn about you as the candidate as you're talking through each one of these subparts, if you will.
Yeah, I think from your perspective, are you trying to get from the interviewer some signal? Like when you give this table of contents, are you trying to get them to tell in some sense where they want you to spend your time? Or is the goal just to organize your presentation? Maybe it's both.
I'm not sure about tells. Maybe I'd be interested to see what kind of tells you provide as an interviewer after someone presents this kind of list. I was thinking more like it helps to show that I'm organized. It also helps me stay organized as I'm telling the rest of the story. So frequently in these long stories, you're not just going to tell the story for 10 minutes, right? The person's going to be interrupting you and asking you questions and sort of taking you down different rabbit holes. And honestly, your job as the candidate is to guide the interviewer towards what's most important. So sometimes you need to kind of eject out of the rabbit hole and you say, okay, I think we've talked about this, right? We're feeling pretty good here. Like maybe let's go and talk about that number 3 thing, right? That hard technical choices that we're gonna make. Should we talk about that, right? So guiding the interviewer back to that list. And it's not that I provided the list in advance that enables me to do that. It's that I know what the list is, right? So I know what's important for me to talk about, and I can guide the person back. So the way I like to think about it is this interviewer is sort of looking at a really big mural on the wall of your project, but they only have a small straw to look through. And they have to sort of pick at these different parts. And so if you just leave them, let them look around the picture, they have no idea what this mural is. And it could take them a very long time to ask the right specific questions. But if you say, hey, there's a person over here and there's a lion over there, and then there's some aliens over here. And you're like, okay, cool. I know where the interesting parts to sort of point my little vision and my little view of this project and get some more information about it as time goes on. It helps the interviewer know what's coming in the future. But I'm interested from you, what do you get some tells from interviewers as you present these table of contents?
I at least in my limited experience on the other side of the table as a candidate, sometimes interviewers will say, yeah, I really want to hear about your alignment and then the rollout. So, they'll tell me places that I can align parts of the story. They might also perk up, and you might see, visibly that they care more about specific areas. So that might help you. But it does kind of come back to this problem that I think you partially addressed here, which is sometimes interviewers will rabbit hole you, and may not actually be your fault on going off into too much detail. The interviewer might have lost track of, what's important in the story or what you want to get across. Do you have any strategies or suggestions for leveling the conversation back or bringing it to those themes that you want to get across?
In any behavioral interview question, it doesn't matter if it's a follow-up question or otherwise, you want to go through this 3-step process. So the first is decode, to understand what the question is really getting at. Then you want to select the right response, then you want to deliver it, right? And so this decode part of the follow-up question is really important. So is this just a clarifying question tell me about what metrics you chose here, right? And that's a sort of clarifying question. Answer the question and you sort of move on with the rest of what you're discussing. But if it's more, it could be a digging kind of question, did anyone have any conflicts around what you tried to do? Right. And they're sort of fishing for something. They're fishing in that space. And so you need to respond to that kind of prompt with perhaps a longer response or more deeply thought through response. So, and in that case, you wouldn't want to just sort of quickly move on back to the things that you're talking about. Obviously, they're interested in assessing some signal in that area. So every time you get a question, a follow-up question or a regular question, assess what is the person trying to get at? What's the question behind the question? Which signal areas is this interviewer assessing? And then how can I give them a response that provides them that signal area?
That is really insightful. And I'm not sure if all of the audience noticed that, but there was actually an inflection in Austen's voice as he asked that second question, which kind of implied that there was some judgment behind it. It's like, was that really, or are you sure? And whenever you sense that judgment, that's usually an indication that, you need to spend more time there because there's probably some doubts on the other side. So being able to distinguish between those two modes of, is this just a detail or maybe an idle curiosity, or is this actually going to impact kind of my assessment? That is tricky, but if you're listening carefully, you can usually hear it from your interviewer and it can help you out a lot. I'd love to get your impression on what are the common things that interviewers tend to go into, like deep dives, additional questions on questions like this. Where do they tend to lead the conversation? So that way candidates can be ready. These are things that I'm likely to want to go into.
Right. So that brings up this meta point that if you are likely to talk about some key projects, so spending some time in advance, identifying what you're going to say about each one of your key projects, maybe 3 or 4 projects that you have, is super valuable. It's going to make you feel confident. It's going to make your delivery really smooth. That's going to enable you to identify these pieces of the table of contents. And you should prepare some really common follow-up questions. And those follow-up questions are things like, what would you do differently, right? I think an interviewer may not have anything else to ask, but they can always ask you for some reflection, right? They might ask you, what's the hardest part, the hardest technical part, or the hardest organizational part, or whatever the project was about. How did you measure success? That's a really common one. So how did you know if you were done, or how did you know that the project was working, right? Did you encounter any conflicts? I think that's one's really common.
Conflict. We love conflict.
Yeah, right. And then you sort of go back to what we talked about earlier in structuring a conflict response. And then there's oftentimes forward-looking questions like, what would you do next on this project? It's like, wow, the project's done. You wrapped it up with your little results and learnings piece, but now what? What are the next steps? And they're looking for some kind of strategic ownership, again, of whatever this is. The next step in the technical project, the next step in the product. That's what they're looking for. So those are really common questions that people ask.
Yeah, and then you can, I guess, see the recursiveness of a lot of these questions, that they beget other questions that you can get into. So I think in some sense, there is some benefit to having connectedness amongst your stories. So that way, when your interviewer goes into conflicts that are related to that project you just spoke about, you're able to give a more customized version rather than having to jump them out of context and give them a conflict that's completely unrelated where you have to go and tell them about another project itself. So think about some of these common questions and how they might actually pertain to just this question, because oftentimes that's going to be the fastest path to you delivering signal to your interviewer. Sometimes interviewers want you to tattle on yourself a little bit. These are not my favorite style of questions. I think in interviewer trading, sometimes people refer to these as trapdoor questions, where you're basically giving a candidate a chance to hang themselves. And in some sense, it's not a good idea to ask as an interviewer because, the easiest way to avoid the trapdoor is just to never open it. But these questions are also somewhat useful in general because they're getting at really important characteristics of how do you grow, how do you perceive failure. So let me give an example that we can dive into, Austen. Let's talk about, tell me about a project where you failed. Is there a perfect response that a candidate should give here? Some fancy response that I've never failed at a project before because my standards are too high, or is it something else?
Right. So if you never go even near the trapdoor, then that's not good. And I think that in this modern tech culture, we expect failure. We expect you, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough, right? Something like that. Or this is the land of the pivot here in Silicon Valley. So we expect you to try something and then have to try something else. And failing fast becomes this mantra that we tell ourselves on the product side. So yeah, it is not good for you to say something like, hey, I never fail. I've never failed in my life. I think A, that either showcases that you have not been taking enough risks, or B, you're lying to me, right? And I think neither one of those are great looks for you as a candidate. But there is a trap here, right? Like you talked about. And so the candidate or the interviewer is looking for growth and self-awareness, right? So your ability to reflect on things that you went through, and maybe they're also assessing perseverance, your ability to sort of get through something that might have been difficult, and of course something like how you make decisions, judgment, and then ownership on whether you push through and carry things over the line for yourself. So I think that when we're choosing these questions or choosing these responses, they want to see failure, some real failure. but not too much failure, right? Or maybe not the wrong kind of failure. And so there's some sort of Goldilocks zone where maybe there's some significant failure that you're going to have to learn from and maybe do differently, but it's also recoverable enough for you to show resilience. So maybe, again, some examples might be, I don't know, helpful for folks who are out there. Maybe you designed something, right? Designed some solution for a system, and it needed some refactoring once it got to production under a certain amount of load, right? Maybe you built a solution for the team and you ended up kind of doing the opposite, like you over-engineered it, and then it became difficult to maintain. Or if we were to think about other dimensions, like product dimensions, maybe the feature that you built was requested by users but never ended up being used by them, something like that. Or maybe you took too long to build something and the business no longer wanted it, or that had some kind of effect on the market. There could be process-oriented sort of failures, right? So maybe you moved too fast and you created quality issues. That's a classic one. So the trade-off between speed and quality. Or maybe you moved too slow, right? And then you missed some market opportunity. Another classic one is planning failures. So you, as an engineer, you're often asked to estimate how long things were going to take. Maybe you underestimated it, right? Maybe you didn't account for dependencies. Maybe you missed some edge case. Of course, all this varies by level, like we've talked about in the past. You need to choose a failure which is commensurate with your level. But I think the key part, the part about not falling through the trapdoor, is that you have some kind of hypothesis in the beginning of the story about why whatever choice you made was the right choice. So for example, if your failure is something like, I didn't put in tests and then we had some bugs in production, then yes, you are having some self-reflection. That's good. Humility, that's good. Maybe growth mindset, maybe that's good too. But you're also showcasing poor judgment. Like, yes, of course, you didn't put any tests, so you have these failures. But instead, if you say something like, well, we made this decisions really quickly in the beginning because, I don't know, time pressure from the CEO or something like this, and then we ended up sort of paying for it later. There's some kind of hypothesis in the beginning about why why your approach would have or could have worked. And then in that case, your judgment is not being questioned. I think you avoid sort of hanging yourself, on the rope that's provided to you by the interviewer.
Yeah, I like the kind of like, could a person at your level have anticipated this beforehand? Is a really good lint to take your story through. And if as you're telling it, you're going, oh, it's pretty obvious that this is not going to work, then your interviewer is thinking the same thing. And so be really careful of those. But Austen, I noted through the examples that you were giving that oftentimes you were really zoning in on places where there's trade-offs, where there's like not a right or wrong answer, that it's ultimately a question of where we put that threshold and where we choose. Is that kind of the key to responses here?
Yeah, there could be different framings, right? And that's kind of what you're getting at, is maybe there's some frames that we can apply, and you can even back apply them, I think, in some ways. So maybe you didn't apply them at the time, but maybe they make sense in retrospect. So let's talk about how we could frame some of these mistakes in the past. And maybe our audience could also, make some comments about like what these different framings could be. But the ones that come to mind when I think about them are speed over quality. I talked about that one, right? So sometimes you want high quality, and then maybe it takes too long. Sometimes you want speed, and maybe that's the quality trade-off there. Sometimes there's the incorrect data. This is like the research problem I brought up, this incorrect data. You have the wrong data. You made a decision based on data, but it was the wrong data. Users said they wanted this, but the revealed preference is different. They did something different in reality. Or maybe, we collected some initial responses from our analytics, but that ended up being wrong at scale, something like that. And then sometimes it's just, we did this last time. Like, this is what we did. This is what we've always done. And maybe that's worked in the past, and that's fine. Sometimes the shortcut for decisions is that we look to see what has been successful in the past. And we have reason to believe that will be repeated, but then it didn't work out this time. So those are all, I think, helpful framings. Can you come up with any other framings that might be helpful?
Yeah, these are all good trade-offs. I'd love to actually see what people drop into the comments. I mean, the other ones that I can think of are really about kind of like, what are the priorities or values that the organization have? Those are usually for higher level leadership kind of questions, but oftentimes there's not a correct answer there. And usually two values are going to have trade-offs in the limit, and they make for really interesting stories about why you are operating with one set of values over another. It sounds like there is also a delivery component here, like in as much as the trapdoor is about you kind of admitting to something that your interviewer is obviously thinking is not going to work out. What would you propose as a structure for people in responding to a question like this? Do you have any like 1, 2, 3s that we can use?
continue to use a star or Carl format still makes sense for this kind of question. But like we talked about, the context section of this situation task part needs to be sure to include what the believable hypothesis was of why this could work out. So make sure that you land that really solidly in that introduction, right? And then oftentimes, since this is kind of like it's a failure that you didn't anticipate. Obviously, if you had anticipated the failure, you would have done something different. So there must be some component in here in the action part about how you discovered what happened, and so that needs to be where does a flip switch go from like, oh, I made a mistake, and then there needs to be some active part of you handling the mistake, right? So hopefully the story includes you taking proactive actions to correct that mistake, or at least fix it next time, whatever, recover from whatever the failure was. And like I said, do something different the next time. And I think those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for. Especially that in that learning section, that forward-looking part where you've been introspection about what you've learned personally, or maybe what the company or the team has learned, and then you're able to apply those learnings. And then you tell me some really brief, very, very brief story about how you did the differently next time. So if it was like you underestimated in one project, then you tell me like, oh, and the next time I got more advice from senior engineers to understand what the scope of the problem might be and get some estimates and compared with some previous timelines, and then my next timeline was better. So I think that kind of following up these mistakes and learnings questions, these trapdoor questions, always with what you did differently next time, is a really strong move.
The next category of question that I have in mind is a little bit interesting. Sometimes companies will notice something like, oh, we're not moving fast enough, or we're not taking enough risk. And so they will transform those into questions that they ask for new employees as a means to try to bias the talent distribution so that they can get people who epitomize those things that they either don't do well or that they really want to do well in the future. So like one great example that we see pretty commonly being asked are, give me an example of a calculated risk that you've taken where speed was critical. What's your take on this question, and how would you say that candidates ought to respond?
Yeah, we keep covering these questions that embody these core Silicon Valley beliefs, or these ways that tech companies operate. This is the sort of move fast and break things question, right? How do I get business value really fast and taking the right risks? And so, of course, they're assessing your prioritization. They're assessing your understanding of these kinds of trade-offs. They're assessing your understanding of the overall business context and making the right trade-off, right? Also, maybe there's a pressure component to this question. Perhaps there's a sort of speed piece, right? Maybe you had to make a decision under difficult circumstances. And so if you are, in this case, it's kind of different than the previous one about weaknesses, where I want to see that you were right, to move fast, right? If the question is, if you took some risk and you were wrong, where speed was not critical, or where the speed did something bad that could have been avoided, then that's not a great story to pick. So the risk needs to be something that's calculated, right? Not reckless. You need to think about, we decided to cut this corner or that corner because XYZ, and that was the right choice. And oftentimes I want to see that that you have mitigated this risk in some way. So we have baked in time for handling technical debt later, or we did additional layers of testing or something like this in order to ensure that what I built was correct, or that you had some sort of a phased rollout. Whatever the mitigation strategies are for moving fast, I want to see those in the story outcome.
What are some example risks that you hear from candidates that you would say are gold standard, or maybe some of the better stories that you've heard?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it varies by level, right? And so you want to choose one that's appropriate to your level, like we've been talking about. Maybe ideally you have some really great suite of automated tests, but perhaps you don't have time to build that, or whatever, don't have resources. And so you instead relied on some like passive manual testing. Maybe that's okay, right? Or maybe, you decided to launch this would be more of like a junior person, I guess that's the idea here. And that maybe you decided to, build something simpler than you originally intended, or what the product manager might want to have. And you took the risk that the adoption would be poor because they didn't have all the features, right? I think somebody who's more senior, they might their trade-off might be about architecture or something that may last longer, right? So maybe you know that this architecture is not going to scale to web scale or wherever the destination is that you want to get to. But for your small set of test users for the first few months, you're fine with it, and you just want to get it out there. So you made some sort of you acquired some technical debt that you're going to pay down later. And then maybe for more senior folks, there's probably some risks around choosing the right technology. And maybe you chose legacy technology, even though because you knew you needed it to work in a high quality way and be able to build it fast, even if you knew that would cause limitations later in terms of what the product could achieve. But you decided to bias that. Or maybe do the opposite. So maybe you chose some kind of emerging technology to capture the user market in some innovative way, even though if you knew that maybe it doesn't work all as well or as smoothly, or the developer experience is not as great as the more mature process, right? So I think those are the kinds of risks that I see people taking.
Got it. For people who are moving between kind of like a category of companies like big tech to startups or startups to big tech, there's oftentimes a bunch of cultural baggage that comes. So like if I'm in big tech, everything that I'm doing seems like it's risk averse to someone who's working in a startup. Whereas in a startup, everything I do seems reckless to someone who's working in big tech. What's the appropriate way to like contextualize this so that candidates can give the right impression to their interviewer with respect to the stories they have?
Now, this is a great question, because this is frequently what you need to do. You use this word contextualize. This is frequently what you need to do on many stories if you're going from sort of one stage of company to another stage of company. It's not always about exactly what you did. It's more about the thinking, why you did that thing. So that's the repeatable part. The repeatable part is your thought process, your ability to gather data and make decisions based on the business context, the technical decisions, the product needs, the whatever data you acquired through tests. So those are that kind of those are what contextualize the work for us and trying to figure out whether or not you made the right call. So that's how I would mitigate this risk of telling the story that might not fit with the culture of the company you're trying to apply to, is to add a healthy layer of why you made those choices and what your thinking was at these different phases.
I like the emphasis on the thought process, because that in some sense is what interviewers are trying to unpack. So this is great. I'd love to just go into a question that's more common in staff and senior staff loops. Tell me about the hardest feedback that you've ever had to deliver. At these levels, companies are expecting that you're not just receiving feedback, that you're giving it. They really expect their senior-most ICs to, in some sense, be exemplars for the rest of the organization. And there's obviously a few angles to this question. It's like, what constitutes hard or difficult feedback for you? What kind of feedback have you actually had to deliver in your experience? And then how did you go about executing it? I'd love to understand from your side, what is this question trying to get at? And then, what are the key things that candidates should be thinking through in terms of how they can organize their own stories?
Yeah, providing feedback to others, right? Helping other people grow, not just yourself and your own responsibilities, but like what are the whether it's your people that report to you, or maybe it's like peers, right? People who are on other teams, like how are you making these people grow? And I think that brings in a lot of variation. So sometimes there's a power dynamic that you have where you're telling some story about your reports, and sometimes you are influencing without any kind of formal power, right? And so those are very sort of different stories I get at different signals. But I would think that companies are, like you said, trying to assess what you think is hard. Maybe what you think is hard reveals something about your scope, about your maturity. Also, if it's hard, then that means that you probably had to navigate some kind of emotionally charged conversation, and that's really important. And then they're probably also assessing whether you can, like my old manager used to say, like land the plane. How can you land this feedback in a way that makes the person willing to change, and can you drive change in someone else, especially if you don't have power over them? So that's a big thing that they're going to be assessing in a question like this one. So yeah, you talked about this one being more for senior leaders or leaders of some kind. There could be interesting stories that someone could come up with for this one. So maybe for someone who is newer on the leadership side, it could be telling someone that their task performance is not what's expected of them, right? That could be a hard conversation, right? Or maybe asking somebody to redo something. Maybe there's giving feedback to your manager. Like that could be something that could be challenging or difficult to do, as if you're early in your career. It may be anything that has to do with performance management. We kind of touched on that, right? Or maybe someone's not going to get promoted. That could be an examples of things that early career folks could find difficult. So if you're more senior, I think that you need to choose something that might be a little bit more complex than that. So maybe if you're a level 7 or like a senior manager or a director, then I find things difficult to deliver. Things like, hey, there's some kind of behavior happening on your team, maybe off the team, that is suboptimal. Maybe it doesn't fit with some kind of like expectation. I can't point to say like this expectation is not being met, but it's the way that you look at people in meetings or something like that, right? Something's about culture, right? It's not measurable outcome. I can't say like, yes, you delivered the code on time or you did not, but it's something about the way that you're working. And oftentimes at this kind of level, these are the things that start to matter, right? Is these more softer skills. Maybe it's letting go somebody who is trying hard. So I think this kind of example of somebody that's struggling but is not putting in the effort, I think that's an easier conversation than someone who, wow, this person's really giving it everything they have and it's just not working for them. Then this is where the power parts come in, right? So if it's like one thing to have a hard conversation with someone that reports to you, that's a little easier for an experienced leader. But when you're having a conversation with someone who you don't have any reporting relationship with, then now you're really testing the quality of your personal relationship, the quality of your ability to land that feedback, or like you're providing feedback, way up the chain, like skip level, skip level, those sorts of things. Can you drive change at that level? So these are like the stakes, of course, increase as the level expectations increase.
Well, Austen, this has been a lot of fun and super informative, and I hope that we partly succeeded in helping you all in the audience to understand a little bit about how interviewers are looking at your responses to these common questions. If you'd like to learn more about other common questions, feel free to check out our community questions section on the Hello Interview website. I'll include a link in the description. And if you haven't already, go and check out Austen's Substack. He has a lot of great writing about the thought process of interviewers, and then also those steps that you'll have to prepare your stories and get ready to crush your interviews. I think he has definitely put more thought around this than basically anyone in the world. It's a phenomenal resource for all things behavioral. So I wish you all the best and hope that everyone has a good one. Thanks again, Austen.
Thank you. Great to be here.